Steve, it's good to have you back with us again. Always good to talk to you. It's all been happening in North Africa and the Middle East. It all seemed to happen so quickly. One second there was just a story about some unrest in Tripoli. The next thing, the whole of North Africa has caught fire. Was anyone expecting it?
No one was expecting it. The French, who keep a close eye on North African affairs, have had a long colonial involvement there and a post-colonial involvement as well, taken by surprise. The British as well. The United States really out of it. The whole thing was quite unexpected, and it was triggered off, as you pointed out, by a vendor in Tunis who was denied the ability to sell his vegetables, and he immolated himself, burned himself, which, as your older viewers will remember, is a very powerful symbol that came out of the Vietnam War, when Buddhist monks were immolating themselves to call attention to the authoritarian nature of the South Vietnamese regime. And it seemed to spread from there. Popular demonstrations and then overreaction by the governments using live ammunition and harsh tactics rather than allowing the demonstrators to have a legitimate voice in protest. And of course the Facebook and Twitter and cell phone revolution made it possible for these largely middle-class, unemployed young people to communicate with each other, to call a time and place for a demonstration, to communicate with people across national boundaries. An Arab awakening, some are calling it. Some call it the Arab Spring. It's something that is analyzed and puzzled over by the Western countries that, as you say, it did not anticipate this.
Because the scenes in that square in Cairo, when they were calling for President Mubarak to step down, those were astonishing scenes. When you consider that President Mubarak was seen by the West as a friend, as a moderate leader, as someone that they could work with. Mm-hmm. He's been there for donkey's years. Next thing you know, he's being overturned by this crowd in the square. Mm-hmm. All the leaders who seem to be targeted are people who have been largely in power for decades.
Well, I guess we should ask how they stayed in power for decades. By deception, by harshness, by brutality, by imprisoning their opposition figures, controlling the press, otherwise dominating the paradigm of leadership. But interesting that you mentioned popularity in the West. I remember Mikhail Gorbachev. He's regarded as a hero because he presided over the end of the Soviet Union. He's regarded as a donkey in Russia because he ended the welfare system. Many people were impoverished. Russia is now much reduced as a world-leading power, and people like Putin are much more revered, a strong man. So who we think is a friend is quite different to what the local people think are the best kind of leaders. So Mubarak, yes, popular in the West. He stabilized, he made peace with Israel. He kept the oil flowing. He worked with the United States in counterterrorism. But one other point here, Allan, is that it was the popular demonstrators that set the context, but of course it was the army that tipped him out at the end of the day. The army is, as in many Middle Eastern countries, the arbiter of leadership. And as long as you satisfy the army, and the same is true in Thailand, for example, and other countries around the world, if you satisfy the Army's basic demands, they will support you. If you violate them or if you cause extra trouble for them, and popular demonstrations are something armies don't like, then you may be invited to relocate in a more peaceful place and take your retirement fund with you. And let a new group of people attempt to reform the government in a more satisfactory way. And we hope that will be the outcome in Egypt.
So what went wrong in Libya? Why has that smoothish transition not happened there? Why do we find ourselves in a civil war situation with NATO enforcing a no-fly zone? What's the difference between Libya and Egypt?
We have to look at how Gaddafi consolidated his rule. He was a nationalist. He turned to a more radical form of Islam, and then he turned around and condemned the most radical form, which is the Al-Qaeda, Taliban form of Islam. So he walked both sides of the streets very astutely in many respects. He had the army on his side, but he didn't allow the army to develop professionally. So the army was somewhat fragmented and allied to him through payoffs, through personal relationships, through tribal relationships. Libya is a country of maybe a dozen tribes, so rallying his tribe and a few allied tribes against the others, mainly in the east, was another tactic of his leadership. So consequently, when the system began to break apart, then those army officers not so closely allied with Gaddafi defected to the rebels. The tribes in the east also defected to the rebels. There were many others who were dissatisfied middle-class people, unemployed people who had not shared in the oil wealth that was monopolized largely by the Gaddafi clan, his family, his tribe, and other close supporters. And then there were some intellectuals who honestly thought that the Libyan pattern was wrong, that the Western idea of rule of law and a greater degree of democracy was the right course of action. And they have now not actually joined the rebels, but they have left the Gaddafi regime. The rebels are poorly organized. They don't have an alternate political party or an alternate military or militia. They don't have a coherent leadership, although one is forming up out of some of the defectors from the Gaddafi regime. And as a consequence, it's a stalemate that they can defend with the help of NATO airstrikes, but they can't launch an offensive which requires heavy weapons like tanks and artillery, which they're not able to operate because they're inexperienced at military arts. And Gaddafi can defend himself in Tripoli and the surrounding area probably indefinitely, given that he has some $7 billion worth of gold or other liquid assets that he can use to pay off his supporters. He can't get to his overseas assets, which are much more vast because they're frozen by the United Nations order. But he can certainly, at a local level, exercise a lot of influence, and he is doing that with considerable effectiveness.
Okay, let's hold that thought. We'll take a break and then we'll come back and talk some more. Join us again in a couple of minutes. And welcome back to End Zone Focus. We're trying to shed some light on the less than straightforward subject of the Middle East at the moment. Our guest in the studio is Dr. Stephen Hoadley, who's the Associate Professor of Political Studies at Auckland University. Steve, before the break we were talking about the two sides in the Libyan conflict, but the rebels are a very mismatched group of people. I mean, the only thing that they have in common is their opposition to Gaddafi. So what sort of outcome are we going to get there? Because there is no obvious successor to Gaddafi.
The nightmare outcome is that the Islamists will take over. The Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, are the best organized opposition figures. They've been suppressed and underground, but they are dedicated. They've worked for years together. If they could capture those opposition movements in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and other parts of the Middle East, and unify the oppositions and work with each other, this would be, for the West and for Israel, the nightmare scenario. So far it hasn't happened. The opposition are moderate, they are Western-oriented, they want some sort of what we would vaguely call democracy. At least they want voice in the future government. In Egypt, it seems pretty clear it's going to be military-dominated. Already we see that the military, early as this morning, has cleared Tahrir Square forcefully, and the popular demonstrations may be curbed as the military gradually begins to assert greater control. There will be elections, there will be civilian leaders, that's all good, but the military will stand behind them, and the two will have to work pretty carefully together. But Libya has one trump card, and that's the oil wealth. The oil is there. The foreign oil companies have put exploration and exploitation facilities in place. There are ports, there are markets for the oil. China always is in the background, so they can pay their way. And unlike Iraq, in which the oil was destroyed, or at least the facilities were badly damaged, and Iraq is only now getting back to pre-invasion levels, Libya is in a good position, if the fighting doesn't spread to the oil fields, to start earning, serious money, and thereby pay its way to a more modern government, and hopefully one that would distribute the wealth more widely.
We mentioned Israel. obviously the fact that President Mubarak is gone, he was in many ways their greatest ally in the whole of those surrounding nations. All this unrest must feel like bad news to them.
It does. The Israeli government is being very cautious about interfering in the Egyptian situation. They want to cultivate the goodwill of those Egyptian leaders that are emerging, largely in the army, and a few civilian figures. Israel does have some allies in the Gulf states, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain. Rhetorically, they lash Israel at every opportunity, but in reality, they trade, they have mutual investments, they have mutual interest in resisting radical Islam. So there is a kind of axis stretching from Israel, from Washington through Jerusalem, and then across into the Gulf, the moderate Gulf states, with Jordan somewhat uneasily in the middle. Jordan, Western-leaning, but cautious because it has a large Palestinian population.
But how safe, having seen what happened so quickly and so unexpectedly, how safe would those states be? Because Bahrain's had problems, hasn't it?
Bahrain and Yemen, the president of Yemen, Saleh, is just about to be tipped out, although he's resisting and shooting literally his way, keeping his power. Syria as well. So my word, we could wake up and read in the headlines that one leader after another has departed, and easing them out in some peaceful way is, of course, one of the techniques of statecraft, offering them havens where they can retire, take a bit of their money, but maybe that's the price to avoid civil war and to avoid prosecution by the International Criminal Court. Amnesty for these people is another very contentious issue, with the European governments split, some wanting them to be brought to trial, like Mubarak, and others saying, look, let it lie. Let's move on and try to construct a government without exacerbating existing splits between the different factions in these countries. Stability and some degree of democracy and voice for the people are really what has to be achieved, and then work on spreading the prosperity.
Meanwhile, in Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is being urged to make concessions to the Palestinian Authority, particularly Judea and Samaria, which are sort of really Israeli heartlands in many ways. 83% of his own party don't want that to happen. That sounds like a recipe for more unrest.
It sounds like a recipe for Israeli firmness. Or the Israelis would probably say, look, we surrendered all of Gaza, and what did we get in return? Rockets. There's no percentage in giving up anything to the Palestinians because they are backed, particularly the radical Palestinians, not all of them, by Iran, and by Hezbollah in neighboring Lebanon. And the more radical factions get the arms, they get the money, they get the attention. They are not interested in concessions. They're interested in eliminating Israel from the face of the earth, so that whether it's 5% or 10% of the territory of the West Bank is retained by Israel, or zero, is almost secondary to the fact that Israel continues to exist. City of Jerusalem continues to be unified under Israeli control and will not be divided, and that the settlements will not be abolished. So there are some intractable problems that I don't see any negotiated solution for.
What's your take on the next few months? I'm sort of reading between the lines that you think it's going to get more difficult before it gets easier.
It could be stable. Israel has the Iron Dome system in place that is intercepting rockets in mid-course. They do conduct counterstrikes against the launching areas in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank area certainly has no power, no negotiating ability. The Palestinians are divided, but on the other hand, no Arab government is mobilizing against Israel. So we don't have a 1967 situation where Israel had to fight for its very existence. We find continuing irritation, subversion, rockets, suicide bombers. The barrier, the security barrier, or the wall, has been effective, and that wall will be extended to more sensitive areas, and that will cause more aggro and criticism. and the settlements will continue to grow in population, if not in geographic size, and that'll cause more irritation. But Israel has the strength, I believe, to withstand all of those criticisms, and will, at least under Netanyahu, stand firm. If an election changes the composition of the Israeli government, of course, that's a different story. But I think even the center in Israel and the left, the Labour Party and others, are beginning to see that Israel's just going to have to live in a condition of a siege for the foreseeable months and years, and no negotiations, no matter how much Obama wants to facilitate these, are going to negotiate away the intractable, the fundamental differences between the jihadists on the one side and the Israeli government on the other.